Get the Angel Reese special at McDonald's now. Let's break it down. My favorite barbecue sauce, American cheese, crispy bacon, pickles, onions, and a sesame seed bun, of course. And don't forget the fries and a drink. Sound good? Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
At participating restaurants for a limited time.
Today's episode is sponsored by NerdWallet's Smart Money podcast. Life comes with big money questions like, are target date funds a smart or lazy way to invest? Should you pay off debt or invest extra cash? Can you deduct your dog as a home security system on your taxes? NerdWallet's Smart Money podcast has the answers. Their finance journalists break down investing strategies, tax planning, smart ways to build wealth, and navigate big financial decisions. Work smarter, not harder on your finances this year. Follow NerdWallet's Smart Money podcast wherever you listen. And stay tuned until the end of the episode to hear the Smart Money trailer.
I'm Julia Turner, and this is the Slate Culture Gabfest. 0 Day makes Robert De Niro our Befuddled President edition. It's Wednesday, March 5th, 2025, and on today's show, we're talking about 0 Day, the star-studded new Netflix thriller featuring Robert De Niro himself as an ex-president who is thrust back into the spotlight after a catastrophic cyber attack when he's named the head of an all-powerful commission trying to figure out who did it and make sure it never happens again. Then, what was it about Gene Hackman? We'll talk about the particular excellence of the great actor who was found dead last week in his Santa Fe home, along with his wife and one of their dogs. And finally, in a New Atlantic piece, psychiatrist Richard A. Friedman writes about the problem with optimism in a crisis. We'll tackle the virtues and pitfalls of looking on the brighter side during dark times in general, and since we're a culture show, culturally. Joining me today is Steve Metcalf. Hello, Steve.
Hello, Julia.
And in for Dana is Slate's own Sam Adams. Welcome, Sam.
Oh, thank you for having me, Julia.
Shall we dive into the dark, mysterious world where everything is stopped working and De Niro is in charge? Wild enthusiasm on the Zoom.
Fiction.
Fiction. All right. Well, 0 Day has been at the top of the Netflix charts or near it since it debuted a couple weeks ago. And the cast is absolutely loaded. Beyond De Niro, we've got Joan Allen as his wife, Lizzie Kaplan as his daughter, Connie Britton as his former chief of staff and maybe his former mistress, Jesse Plemons as an aide, Angela Bassett is the president in this world, Dan Stevens is a kind of lefty Tucker Carlson type, Matthew Modine is the majority leader, Gabby Hoffman is a tech titan, Clark Gregg is Jeffrey Epstein. It keeps going. I count 18 Oscar noms and 3 wins on that list alone, and if you add the Emmys and SAGs and BAFTAs, you can barely see the show through the heaping pile of gold statues. And the show itself is basically just as packed with plot, both political and personal, as De Niro's new commission tries to find the cyber attackers who've paralyzed the nation. We're going to start with a clip from the first episode where we hear De Niro, until recently pleasantly retired as ex-president Mullen. On the day after the initial attack, he's gone down to the site of a train crash and is addressing a crowd that's growing unruly and impeding the work of the folks who are trying to excavate the bodies and maybe survivors at the crash.
Please, what's the matter with you? This is exactly what they want us to do.
Who's they, Mullen? You don't even know who they
You're
are.
You're right, I don't know who they are, neither do you, none of us do. But if we keep shouting at each other like this, what are we going to accomplish? We're Americans, what are we doing? We're supposed to be standing up for each other. We're supposed to be helping each other. What, you think you're doing the right thing? No, you're not. You're afraid. And you think if you get worked up over some bullshit conspiracy nonsense that won't make you afraid? No. You're not behaving like an American, nor a patriot.
Sam, you wrote about this show for Slate magazine. Why don't you kick us off with what you made of this project?
Well, I did not like it very much. I think that's sort of the initial selling point of this series before De Niro and the cast of thousands of awards got on board was that this is sort of a story about Washington created by political insiders. The creators, among them are Noah Oppenheim, who's the former head of NBC News, who also now is a screenwriter, wrote the movie Jackie, and Michael Schmidt, who's the New York Times reporter, double Pulitzer winner. We should, in theory, be getting this very granularly informed view of insider politics. And what we get instead is a kind of pundit-brained centrist muddle in which the greatest enemy facing the country is political polarization. And that just feels like a really inadequate way of looking at the situation, even presumably a year ago when this was finished production, let alone now.
Steve, pundit brain muddle or trenchant critique of our troubled democracy?
The show answers the age-old question. I think Socrates might have put it to Glaucon in the Agora. Can something be both turgid and slack at the same time? I didn't think the answer was yes, but the Platonic forms have crashed into one another, exploded, and created this dud, this absolute dud. It's terrible television. I mean, there's just no getting around it. As an example of what counts as terrific television, I'm just engrossed by The Pit, right? Which is just nothing original about it. It's completely formulaic, and it's just beautifully delivered by prose. Sam's absolutely right. There's no granularity here. People speak in blocks of exposition. The visual style of it is the equivalent of that. It's clunky, amateurish, everything is telegraphed. The pasty incel demagogue, to give you an example of the pundit brain centrism, is the pasty incel demagogue is a left winger when absolutely everything about him is coded, as Sam says, as a Tucker Carlson type. There is no equivalent figure that I can think of in real life. That is clearly an attempt to play it down the middle when there is no middle. The middle's dead. It's a shame. Mike Schmidt is a terrific, engaging guest. You long to have a beer with him when you hear him on the Daily podcast. How his name became associated with something so half-assedly imagined, it just made me incredibly sad. There were all kinds of opportunities for trenchancy that were lost here. I mean, this is of the moment in a lot of superficial ways that could have been non-superficial. I also don't think anyone's good in it. Literally, I don't think there's a single good performance in it. The standout bad performance to me is Jesse Plemons as a kind of body man Friday to the president. I find his performance distractingly weird, as though he's just been handed the script and developed no character. This is terrible television. Julia, what do you think?
I wish for the sake of debate, I could come out swinging with a rousing defense, but I think it's actually interesting to try to figure out how it got where it got, given all of the talent that's been poured into it. And I think there are a couple issues. One, actually, the comparison to The Pit is totally interesting, Steve, because the thing that show does beautifully is commit to whatever the tension or conflict or human emotion in any given moment or plot line is, and let the actors feel and act those feelings, and actually takes quite small things about like whether the presiding doctor disapproves of how much time the doctor is spending with her patients, and like turns that into a running emotional theme. And this show does not ever give anybody space to have a proper relationship. There's like a moment, there's an implausible romantic relationship between Jesse Plemons' character and Lizzie Kaplan's. It's not a spoiler particularly because it is revealed at the end of one of the first couple episodes. And there's one moment where they're having a conversation where Lizzie Kaplan seems to be in a normal relationship and actually like registers at a human level. And I remember sort of like sitting up and being like, aha, there's like a recognizable human person. But the other thing, so they don't give these great actors enough to do with each other that makes any emotional sense. And then it also doesn't make any political sense. I don't object to a show. I don't think a conspiracy thriller has to necessarily be making a particular trenchant critique about society. Like it could just be ambient. And some of the look and feel here comes from Leslie Linka Glatter directed all 6 of these and was behind the look and feel of Homeland. I mean, the conspiracy bona fides here are pretty good in the visual direction, and it certainly looks like that kind of show. It's leached of color almost everywhere. But one thing that intrigued me is for several stretches of this show, De Niro's character Mullen isn't sure whether he's losing his mind. Obviously, the figure of a respected American leader who might be losing his marbles and what it would be like to be in his shoes is like an interesting thing to encounter at this moment in American history, and like an interesting thing for one of our legendary actors to do for us. And yet you take the notion of is a demagogue, a television demagogue actually evil? Jeffrey Epstein is alive and he's pulling the strings, whatever. You could take these different threads from our recent political history and try to play with some of them. But instead of working any one of them in the way that you might work any one of these emotional scenes, they just kind of all get put in the blender, and the blender gets turned on too high. Like just as soon as you get interested in like, oh my gosh, this is like a Biden's eye view of the last couple years of his term. Like, what a heartbreaking, emotional, interesting thing to do, like to be so capable and so incapable at the same time. Like, what a great thing to give De Niro to play. Zzz, like up goes the blender and there goes that idea. And suddenly, you're talking about some mind-bending protocol from the 70s. Like, it's too much. Why is there so much in it? Slow down. Like, it just, structurally makes no sense.
Right. It's trying to touch on a lot of things, and there are that you can sort of point out the real life analogies in this all day long. I mean, not only is the Biden figure like an ex-president, suffering from cognitive decline and a sort of legendary bipartisan figure, but he's also someone who stepped down after a single term following the drug-related death of his son to make way for the country's first Black female president. Like, it doesn't, the Venn diagram there is a circle. But as you were saying, Julia, like it's, I think a lot of the best conspiracy thrillers, in fact, are sort of politically unaffiliated because they come from the sense that the world is fundamentally breaking down, and even the rules that might separate left from right no longer make sense. And that can be a really powerful and not in and of itself apolitical thing. It's good to sort of, make people think and feel about whether even what we're told are the two sides of an issue are necessarily the only way to look at things. But among other things, the show kind of just isn't scary enough. Like, a good conspiracy thriller should really leave you unnerved, looking at the world outside and wondering what's going on behind, every closed door. And I just don't, that profound sense of unease doesn't really set in here. I mean, the feeling I felt most frequently was kind of annoyance. There's a running device in this where the Biden character's delusions are represented by their repeated use of this song called "Who Killed Bambi," which is technically a Sex Pistols song, although it's not even sung by Johnny Rotten. And I think it is by design like one of the most annoying songs ever recorded, and also an incredibly weird thing for an 80-year-old to just have floating through his head. And it just, I just felt it like a hammer to the back of the skull every time it came on the soundtrack.
I mean, this strikes me as like a script written by not even a journalist or a pundit, written by a headline writer and AI or something. I mean, it just never takes on life. I mean, in terms of the politics, like, look at the politics of the pit. I mean, they're not screamingly obvious or left-wing. They're probably Hollywood left-wing, I guess. But there's a way in which if you make a medical drama about an emergency room, you have to get into the state of healthcare in America. It's underfunded. It's overcrowded. There's a Trumpy coded guy in the waiting room who's clearly a ball of violence and resentment and racial resentment. Like, we live in this world, right? This world doesn't take place in the center of the road politically. It takes place at the crossroads of enormous political conflicts. So how can you both be topical? Like, how can you try to cash in on the topicality of all of this stuff without somehow impacting within it all of what is actually making us anxious and miserable. It's completely foolish. The other thing I would say is that it's just bad at the level of a thriller. It's so, I hate to keep using The Pit. It's just a touchstone because I watched it last night and it's good TV. But the other thing The Pit does is that they did their fucking research, right? And there's a sense that you are in an emergency room. And in this show, you have it's almost as broadly written at points as 24, right? It's like, it's like the ex-president himself, who's a freaking octogenarian with cognitive issues, is not only heading some commission, which is, probably a PR stunt in real life, if such a thing happens, and making public pronouncements. He's doing the investigation. He's doing it in interrogation himself. Look at him. He still has his interrogation chops left over from Indochina, his days in Indochina. It's so screamingly stupid at the level of just thriller genre execution. I stuck with it. Weirdly, I stuck with it. I even got to the point, Sam, I don't know if you did, where you find out why that song, annoying song, pseudo Sex Pistols song, is rolling through his head. After that, I could go no further, but that was several hours in.
I mean, it does kind of snack on by. Like I watched, because it's so bewildering and because there's so much in it, there's a little bit of a narrative pull of like, wait, what? Where's this going? But it's kind of a like, when you're driving through fog and you just kind of want to get to where you can see the road again, like it has a little bit of a pull in that way. I suspect you have not seen this, Steve, but Sam, have you seen the Benny of Paradise?
I have not.
The show starring Sterling K. Brown.
No, I keep hearing about it. And it sounds like those in the pit are the sort of the two of the moment.
Well, I abandoned Paradise too, but it's striking because both of these shows start in the comfortable homes of former presidents and star or center on the world around the life of the ex-president and a world gone massively wrong. And I just think it's so interesting that those are that trope should emerge twice at this moment. And it's suggestive to me of this sense of like, well, if the current president is going to be a one of one, maybe we can look to ex-presidents to be the figures that we're taking as the starting points for some of these shows. And it's, that one seemed to have more control of its tone than this one, but not in a way that made me want to keep watching it. So I'm not exactly exhorting people to go see that show, although Sterling K. Brown is always amazing and everything. But it just is striking to have two pilots that are like the comfortable, well-appointed, not quite mansion, but really nice home with the security guys around of the ex-president.
In Hudson, New York, by the way.
I know, Steve.
You remember when we started the show and I was living outside of Hudson and I would talk about a pie stand and we'd get 50 emails screaming, "Where is? No one even knows where that is. Why would anyone ever go there? Why is he talking about some pie stand?" And now it's like a touchstone place for an ex-president in a shitty TV show to live.
Well, it looked great.
It's my greatest achievement, really.
Yeah, we can thank you for that plot point. All right, well, it's Zero Day. It's on Netflix. A lot of people are watching it. Maybe you are too. Let us know if you have thoughts, defenses, critiques, or any particular performances you'd like to single out for good or ill.
Not the CIA.
If the public finds out how deep this really is, I don't think we survive that.
If there's one thing to learn from the entertainment industry, it's just how easy it is to earn a reputation, even if it doesn't reflect who celebrities really are. For example, everybody thinks that Discover is a card that isn't widely accepted, but in reality, it's accepted at 99% of places that take credit cards nationwide. Yeah, 99%. So maybe now you'll think twice before judging a book by its cover. Unless it's a celebrity cookbook, in that case, judge away. Based on the February 2024 Nielsen report, learn more at discover.com/creditcard.
Gene Hackman, one of Hollywood's titanic talents, was found dead last week at the age of 95. In one tribute to him in the New York Times, the actor Ben Stiller described him as one of the 4 actors on my Mount Rushmore, with Al Pacino, Robert De Niro, and Dustin Hoffman. When Gene Hackman said something on screen, you believed him. There were a number of other tributes that put him in similar pantheons, some scrambling them a little bit and adding Jack Nicholson and taking other folks out. But I think there is pretty universal agreement that he's one of the legends of Hollywood in his era. And we wanted to take some time this week to look back at some of his performances and talk through why exactly he was so great and what it was about him that made him so great. And we each started by revisiting a different film or a couple of films. So, Steve, what did you watch and why was Gene Hackman Gene Hackman?
I rewatched The French Connection, which I was too young to see when it first came out. I just missed it by a few years in terms of, being the right age for it. I think it came out in 1971. The William Friedkin cop thriller takes place in New York City. But I hadn't seen it. I hadn't seen it in looking back, and I probably hadn't seen it in close to 30 years. Hadn't rewatched it. Hackman became very, very well known and immediately respected. He got a supporting actor nomination for Bonnie and Clyde. So he wasn't by any means an unknown when he made French Connection. I think it's fair to say French Connection broke him as a huge movie star, which he stayed pretty much for the rest of his life. He won the Best Actor nomination for it. It's a bravura performance. It's loosely based on a true story about a giant heroin shipment that's coming in from Marseille, France, and these two gritty cops played by Hackman. Popeye Doyle is his name, and Roy Scheider is his partner. And it's an important movie no matter what for Hackman's performance, which is astonishing, but also for the fact that Friedkin borrowed a technique that he had never seen in a feature film before he saw Costa Gravas's political thriller Z, which is to shoot a fictional film, a feature film, as if it were a documentary, which now, of course, has insinuated itself into the DNA of sitcoms, much less, just sort of it's everywhere in filmmaking. But among the reasons that movie is regarded as historically important is it was the first Hollywood film to really use that technique. And the other fascinating thing about it, of course, it's New York City of 1971. It's trash-strewn, ugly, gritty, dirty city, but it hasn't started to self-mythologize. This is sort of the first of the string of Hollywood films that, like Dog Day Afternoon and Taxi Driver, that come out over the course of the 1970s that by 1980 have turned up, sort of culminating in like Escape from New York, like that there's something kind of apocalyptic about the city. And at the center of that landscape is this cop attempting to prevent an enormous amount of heroin from hitting the streets. What's amazing about watching the movie now is the moment when Gene Hackman becomes a movie star is so obvious. There's the famous iconic car chase, and Hackman is wonderful in that. But it's really not that scene. It's much early in the film. It sort of sets up the whole thing where Doyle, he has this whole riff that he does when he's shaking down a person trying to get information, where he says, he says, "You ever been to Poughkeepsie? You pick your feet in Poughkeepsie." It's just this weird patter that's totally disorienting. And there's this scene where he walks into a bar and he kind of gets, it's a bar where drugs flow through the bar, which is why he and his partner are shaking it down. And they get everyone up against the wall, and he's doing this whole wild pattern. The camera's kind of moving around the bar with him. I think by the standards of 2025, frankly, by the standards of any time, it's kind of it's a racist scene. The kind of othering of the black male underclass in the movie is grotesque from the standpoint of now. Nonetheless, Hackman in that scene is incredible, and it culminates with him picking out one guy to abuse in particular, and it's really fucking intense. I think even by the standards of 1971, you're supposed to think this is like a horribly racist cop. And he drags him into a bathroom and locks the door behind him. And then the two of them laugh because it's a cover, right? This guy is his source on the street. And so he has to abuse him most roundly in front of everyone else in order to keep the cover as thick as possible. And it's a funny moment because at that, where they both kind of break, first of all, Friedkin's style of filming is so brilliant that you do sort of feel like you're watching real life. Like the moment isn't played for laughs, or it's not, there's nothing broad about it. And what's extraordinary about that moment is you realize that Popeye Doyle has been acting, not just Hackman, right? In that entire scene up until that moment. And they let you know, so it's so extraordinary the way Hackman lets you know that when the door closes and he immediately breaks character. And it's Hackman acting as Popeye Doyle acting, and then the door closes, and then you get Hackman acting as Popeye Doyle not acting. And in that moment, at least I perceive him as not racist at all, not a brutalist, a man with a job to do who has to get it done. And that humane, that ability of Hackman to smile and just seem so warm and so human, and the little crow's feet around his eyes. I think the extraordinary thing about Hackman is he was never young. You barely have an image of him as a very young man. He just was a middle-aged man from the moment. Even in Bonnie and Clyde, really, he doesn't especially look like a young man. And he broke late as an actor. So he embodied a kind of ideal of middle-aged masculinity as a form of deep and humane self-possession in everything he did. And he brought it to, I love Hackman as much for that bravura performance in French Connection, but also I would say supporting roles in Get Shorty, where he's insanely funny as a kind of Hollywood producer whose humanity keeps getting the better of him, or in Postcards from the Edge, where he's a veteran Hollywood film director, where he provides a center of gravity to a movie about the chaos of a young woman who just cannot make her life cohere. He just was wonderful in everything he did. And he was just so deeply and utterly himself in everything he did.
Yeah, I love that analysis of that scene. Sam, remind us which movie you watched and what you pulled from Hackman about it.
The first movie I thought of when Gene Hackman died was The Conversation, Francis Ford Coppola's surveillance thriller from 1974. It was by no means the first Gene Hackman movie that I saw. You know, I grew up knowing him as mostly kind of a tough guy character actor in movies like Crimson Tide and Unforgiven. For some reason, another one that came right to mind is The Package, where he stars opposite Tommy Lee Jones, a pretty lousy movie that I think he was nonetheless good in. But he was just one of those people who kind of introduced me to the concept of someone who you were like the character actor, like someone you were just always happy to see turn up, even in movies that weren't that good. And he was in so many movies and so good in so many of them that when he retired in the early aughts, he was one of those people, like, it just never occurred to me that there would be movies without Gene Hackman in them. He was someone who was always in movies, would always be in movies, was in a lot of them, and just was almost kind of synonymous with the form to me, but mostly in that one specific type. And then I think when I started, maybe just broadening my tastes, I came around to this Coppola movie in which he plays Harry Call, this sort of audio surveillance expert who may or may not have accidentally uncovered a murder. And what's really striking about this performance, especially when you're more familiar with him in the sort of Popeye Doyle mode, is it's an incredibly internal, kind of almost like creepy and like weirdly asexual performance. And among other things, the sort of quiet strength of it, but also the total unsentimentality of it is something that's really striking for me. He doesn't feel the need to make this character likable. I think he is empathetic in a way. The closest to sort of a soft moment is you see him in his apartment kind of playing saxophone by himself, which is, I think, meant to indicate that he has a soul. But it's, he's just got this sort of weird mustache and sometimes wears this raincoat that looks sort of perpetually oily and almost like this second skin that you want him to shed. And it's just, and he sort of plays an unofficial sort of sequel to this character much later in Enemy of the State in the 90s. I think they didn't get the rights to use the character, but he is similarly a sort of weirdo, surveillance obsessed guy who thinks the government is spying on us and is of course proven correct. But in The Conversation, it's just, it's such a wonderfully like off-putting performance in some ways. And I really like that aspect of what Hackman could bring to a role. I think Popeye Doyle does have those sort of eyes crinkling moments, but he also, there was a couple years ago, I think Disney Plus was showing a version of the French Connection, and they cut out 6 seconds of the movie, which included Papa Doyle using a racial slur, and that was sort of to protect the sensibilities of their audience and not to confront people with offensive content. But it also seemed to me to be very key to the character and the performance that he was willing to do that. He's actually, that is telling you something about the character. It did not seem like something that was put in there accidentally or thoughtlessly. So I think he was really willing to take on not even, the dark sides of characters necessarily, but even in characters who are the sensible heroes, he is willing to show you things that are complicated and unsympathetic, unsentimental. And I think that's, even in characters who are sensitive to the leads, he is willing to show you things that are unsympathetic and sentimental. And I think that's an incredibly valuable aspect of his legacy.
Yeah, it's interesting. The sort of like cantankerous warmth. I mean, cantankerous is even strong. It's not even as aggressive as cantankerousness. There's just like a gruffness. I love your word self-possession, Steve, and the notion of it as a sort of non-antic and centered masculinity that is there is so much anxious masculinity in our world right now and on our screens that a non-anxious version of it feels very comforting to be in the presence of. The movie I watched is Hoosiers, which I've somehow never seen, despite being an enormous fan of both Gene Hackman and sports movies. And so I watched it with my sons, and it's interesting. It's a weirder movie than I thought it was. And what Hackman brings to it is that his character Norman Dale was a successful college coach and then wasn't, for reasons we don't learn about, for a while, and then shows up after a stint in the military to coach this small town team in Indiana, in a town where the whole town lives or dies based on it's the basketball version of Friday Night Lights in terms of the role that the basketball team plays in the town. And he, in a series of pleasing scenes, remakes the young men, kicks aside the local lout who's been training them, demands their respect and demands that they behave appropriately, and builds his various relationships with the young men. And eventually we learn what it is that caused him to stop coaching in college. And as he's trying to mold the men, wrestling with his own failings and his own flaws, and trying to make amends for them and change. And the movie's sort of about whether people can change and grow, made very explicit in the forms of these young men who are still growing, but balanced with the performances of grown men who may or may not still be growing. And Hackman is one of them, and the other is Dennis Hopper, who plays the drunk dad of one of the boys on the team in a bizarre performance, actually. And just the film really would not work at all, I think, without the centeredness of Hackman's performance, because you believe, despite the fact that he's overcoming this flaw and failure in his past, he seems so centered and comfortable in his own skin and confident that he knows what he needs to do. He's not tentative or anxious about the work he's undertaking with these young men. And there's a moment towards the end of the film when he makes a new choice about how to interact with his boys. And it's so quiet. It's just so underplayed. It's just such an old-fashioned movie. I mean, it starts with like 10 minutes of driving through cornfields, and my children were like, what is this? It's only from the mid-'80s, but it might as well have been from, Mesopotamia, because of how alien it seemed to them in terms of its pacing at first. And then, they were complaining and insisting that they were going to have to multi-screen Minecraft to get through it. And then, of course, eventually it got its hooks into them. But it's that self-possession and that centeredness that drew you to him, or a kind of restraint. And it was really wonderful to be in his company again. It's interesting when an actor dies who's already stopped performing, because you mourn him and the work that he did, but you're not mourning the work that may yet have come. I mean, De Niro is 82 and still giving us 0 Day, for better or for worse, and probably will give us some more performances that I hope that we will admire or enjoy or argue with. It's sort of a quieter farewell here to someone who's already stopped doing the thing that we know him for. But it was a treat to go remind myself exactly why he has the reputation he has.
Get the Angel Reese special at McDonald's now. Let's break it down. My favorite barbecue sauce, American cheese, crispy bacon, pickles, onions, and a sesame seed bun, of course. And don't forget the fries and a drink. Sound good? Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
At participating restaurants for a limited time.
Quince is the go-to for luxury essentials at affordable prices. As fans of this show know, when I say it, when Dana says it, we mean it. We both buy from Quince and love the products, and this precedes them ever being a sponsor on the show. Items that are just completely central to my wardrobe. Their linen shirts are a cut above in terms of quality. And I got to tell you, I think that is a 12-month shirt. They're beautifully made. I love them. Quince offers a range of high-quality items at prices within reach: 100% Mongolian cashmere sweaters, washable silk tops and dresses, organic cotton sweaters. Actually, I'm gonna go on as soon as I stop talking and buy an organic cotton sweater. And this is also important to me and Dana. Quince only works with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing practices. Give yourself the luxury you deserve with Quince. Go to quince.com/culture for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/culture to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/culture.
In The Atlantic last week, psychiatrist Richard A. Friedman described his interactions with patients since the election and the inauguration, and said it was a stressful time to be a psychiatrist in America. His patients are anxious, they're worried, they're coming to him with various concerns and fears about their research ending, about the U.S. sliding into autocracy. How, they want to know, can they make themselves feel better, he writes. They haven't liked the answer I've had to give them. This is a hard thing for a psychiatrist to say, but if you're alarmed by Donald Trump's hoarding of executive power and efforts to dismantle the federal government, then maybe you should be. It's an interesting reflection on...
Maybe? Really? You think?
Well, but it's
Wait,
the thing that...
Should I be?
I disagree. Everything's fine.
Well, what's interesting about the piece is that it is this kind of admission that part of the job of a psychiatrist is basically to tell you you shouldn't worry so much about whatever's worrying you. And what do you do when the answer is like, actually, you should?
Right.
And I'm not sure, I can say nothing about the medical virtues of this particular psychiatrist who writes for The Atlantic, but it strikes me as possible that maybe a psychiatrist should also be able to tell you that you don't need to be, that it's not necessarily healthy to be completely consumed with worry either right now, because that's not going to help you solve anything or survive. But I get the point that the stakes feel different. And anyway, we all thought this was an interesting piece, and I think it's worth talking through the psychiatrist dilemma, but it also made us zoom out and think about the human dilemma of the moment, which is, what is your relationship to optimism when things seem dark? Like, how do you create space for it, or don't you? Or does it feel like a dereliction to look at the glass and think that it could be half full? Yeah. Steve, what did you make of this treatise?
Let's start with, I don't think Dr. Friedman is a cognitive behavioral therapist, if I read his piece correctly. Julia, keying off of something you said, I think part of the job of a broadly speaking, of someone in the psychoanalytic space is to say that the emotion that you're having is real, but the source of it isn't what you think it is. And then through a period of, talk therapeutics, often spanning many years, you get the person to come around to what that source actually is. It seems to me when you're in a moment like that's a practice that flourishes in times maybe of peace. Neurosis is a function of being relatively safe, secure in your own home, in your own, in your own life, in ways that maybe we're not, or less so now. And it kind of short circuits what talk therapeutics is sort of built around, right? In the sense that, no, actually the origin of your anxiety is exactly what you think it is. Your conscious mind is perceiving the world correctly when you see that we're endangered politically, and it's only going to get worse, right? So you're talking about suddenly treating people whose fears are entirely realistic. So in maybe some sense that the place to cope with those fears isn't really a psychoanalyst's office. But setting that aside, what is the role of optimism given our current, the headlines that we're getting day after day and the current horizon of experience? Tough. That is a tall order. I would say optimism is unhelpful. Social hope is necessary. Hope is necessary, but the hope can't be grounded in optimism per se. It has to be grounded in pessimism and realism, that something that we all grew up with and took for granted is highly likely, is well on the way to being rubbled. And I think you have to try to bake into your understanding of reality going forward that it's gone. And at a certain moment, hopefully that's going to present an opportunity, which is to rebuild a better and more just world. And, as parent of two children, who are really just on the verge of entering adult life in the world, I have to feel not exactly optimism, but some social hope that they will be able to participate in the rebuilding of a world that doesn't allow for Elon Musk, for example, to make $500 billion in the quote unquote private sphere, though it wasn't even in the private sphere, and gain unmediated access to the digital infrastructure of the payment system of the United States of America. Right? That we could create a world, craft a world in which those sentences, they're even crazier than President Donald Trump, right? Like, as a kid who grew up in New York City and knew exactly who this guy was, right? Like, we've actually found a crazier nonsense sentence from the vantage point even of 2020. So optimism, I think, would, it would make me retch to hear optimism on the part of someone, I respected, but social hope of a real variety, yes, that I think is just totally necessary.
That's interesting. I mean, it makes me think of the speech from the directors of No Other Land, or the producers of No Other Land, at the Oscars, who, despite telling this incredibly bleak story at this unbelievably bleak moment, articulate a kind of grounded social hope that here are four people from different backgrounds seeking to see each other as human. And that was the speech that offered social hope. And, and that I found hopeful, and then also went and read online comments about and found people being absurd and cruel and dismissive about it. It was just like, oh God, there goes my social hope. But Sam, I'm curious what you make of this debate.
I've been thinking a little bit about a distinction that I think you were both sort of drawing implicitly, which is the difference between optimism and hope, which I'm sort of thinking of as the difference between sort of believing things will turn out all right and believing that they might. I think it's fairly clear at this point that, left to their own devices, things are not going in a real good direction just at the moment. But if they are going to go in a better direction at some point, we do need to sort of conceive and believe that that's possible. And I think about like even another sort of relevant movie that won at the Oscars this week was I'm Still Here, which is a Brazilian movie about living through the military dictatorship. And a lot of that movie is sort of a warning about how normal life can seem in that situation, right? And there's not necessarily like a big next stop autocracy sign that starts flashing in the sky to let you know that things have gotten real bad. Like if you're too sort of optimistic and just check out, you will think everything is fine until perhaps the day when it very suddenly isn't. But I think it's, art has the function to sort of sharpen our senses and help us see the world, but we also just need to get enough sleep and eat a good breakfast and like have the energy to face the day. And that can be, part of the function as well. I've also been returning to the words of the great political philosopher, Lloyd Dobler, which is John Cusack's character from the movie Say Anything. And he talks in that movie about optimism as a revolutionary act, which is not just believing that everything is fine, but acting as if it could be, like making a decision. So not sort of passively just, not dealing with how bad things are, but deciding to kind of face the day anyway. And I think that sort of purposeful, focused optimism is a powerful and really kind of essential tool to just hold on to whatever shreds remain of our previous sanity, but also to just take steps in the direction of things being slightly less awful than they are at the moment.
It's interesting that you took it to the psychoanalytic place, Steve, because I also think the cognitive behavioral therapy version of therapy around anxiety is not necessarily to always tell you your anxieties aren't real or that they're not located in the place that you think they are, but to try to help you calibrate the proportionality of your response, or like the it's very focused on like what's the next action you can or should take. And I do think that the correct action is not to probably exist in a state of heightened paralyzed panic that could be instilled by reading the news. Like you do need to find some way to regulate yourself and your responses so that you can live a life and do anything useful. It is so interesting, Sam. The first 30, 40 minutes of I'm Still Here, it's like literally about a family who is too optimistic, actually. And this sort of like, why are you moving out of the country, other family? Like, what do you think's really going to happen here? It's heartbreaking.
Did you really say that?
What?
He's actively participating in the resistance, and they hustle their daughter off. I think
I know, but I
don't think they're optimistic. I think they're staying to fight.
I think no, they're not. They have some awareness, but it's a debate about whether they should send the daughter off. And I think Eunice's, the wife's character, is wondering whether they should also be leaving. And the husband says, no, we should stay, in part because he wants to fight, I think, but he's not.
It's interesting too, because the movie is based on, it doesn't really tell you this anywhere in it. And in fact, he doesn't even seem like a very important character, but the movie is based on a memoir by one of the youngest children in that group. And I think it does sort of move through just a child's sort of dawning understanding of the kind of world they're living in. I mean, part of what I read into that movie, which is sort of resituated mostly from the mother's point of view, the Fernanda Torres character is, and she has kids who are like, college age, leaving the house, and little kids. And a lot of it is just like, how much of this do you communicate to your children? Not just want to sort of keep them safe and happy, but also like what's responsible to tell them. Like, it's not responsible to tell your children that the world is screwed and nothing's ever going to get better. That's you don't want them feeling that way, but you also don't want them believing that, or going out into the world believing that nothing can change or get better, because that's obviously a guarantee that it won't. But they do need to at some point be aware of the reality that they're inhabiting. And I think that sort of, adults have to deal with those two things on their own as well.
No, I mean, trying to make sure my kids understood the gravity of the just dreadful scene in the Oval Office on Friday with Zelensky. And then trying to explain what it means that we've paused military aid to, they're both historians of, the world wars. It's sort of like, so it's basically like we joined the Axis. Like, it's like, how do you, and then you're like, is that too much to say to them? I don't know. It's hard to figure out how to calibrate it. But I have a friend who was posting this marvelous little series on Instagram of like things that make her happy around her house, just like little touches. And after Friday, she announced she was going to pause it. Like, she just felt like it wasn't appropriate. And I completely respect her decision to do whatever she thinks is appropriate to the moment. But I was sad because I really liked seeing her record these little ways in which she's made a home that makes her happy. And it made me happy to think of this person who I'm fond of creating this cozy space to be and be a family in this big, rough world. And I don't know. I don't know if that's optimism or more keeping open the capacity for joy and pleasure, which is maybe not quite the same thing as optimism, but I think is like a crucial survival skill, whether it comes from the cute little objects you put on your shelves or the time that you create with family or wherever else it is that you find joy and pleasure. But I understand the feeling of like not quite knowing what's appropriate to do or what's the right place to put your energy. But I was sad to see the little joy bombs go away.
Right. I've been thinking too about Rebecca Solnit's book, Orwell's Roses, which is about sort of an ode to that sort of release or cultivation. Obviously, Orwell, a very sort of left-wing, politically engaged writer, but also turns out a big gardener. And I think the idea that even if you're George Orwell, like you need some place to go out and just be around things that are red and green, put your fingers in the dirt, remind yourself that there's a real world, and aspects of it continue on, seems essential to just holding on to your humanity and any shred of engagement.
Right. You're not presumably you're not fighting in order to be a hero. You're fighting for a world in which such heroism is unnecessary, right? For a world in which kids do get to like listen to Taylor Swift and you get to cultivate orchids, All
right. Well, on that optimistic note, with sirens blaring in the background of one of our recording studios, we will conclude this discussion of optimism and try to hang on to a little bit of hope.
When you check out at the pharmacy, you see the journey from idea to medicine, thanks to our intellectual property system, or IP for short. IP safeguards inventions, like a new way to prevent seizures or lower cholesterol. And IP supports competition from other brands, then lower cost generics, which are 90% of prescriptions filled in the US. Innovation, competition, lower costs, thanks to IP. Learn more at phrma.org/IP Works Wonders.
Exclusively on ESPN Plus, UFC 313, Saturday. Reigning light heavyweight champion Alex Pereira defends his title against number one contender Magomed Ankalaev, and an explosive lightweight bout between Justin Gaethje and Rafael Fiziev. UFC 313, Saturday at 10 p.m. Eastern. Buy it on ESPNplus.com/PPV.
All right, Steve, can you handle the business today?
I can handle that. Usually what we do right here is plug our Slate Plus, Slat Plus bonus episode that drops at the same time as the show. This week, it's a little different, though, because of the Oscars. It hit the feed already on Monday for purposes of obvious timeliness. But if you haven't had a listen, give it a listen. It was a really fun conversation right on the heels of, I think Adrian Brody was still speaking, actually, when we recorded it. So, but anyway, it was hot off the presses, and it's still hot. And he's still speaking. So give it a listen.
Wait, Steve, you know what? Someone reminded me today about his speech that we didn't even get to in that segment.
The gum.
The gum. The part we threw his gum to his wife.
How did we not talk about the gum?
Which, if he had given a good speech, would have been charming.
Charming, yes, exactly. And also,
but in retrospect.
Anyway, so if you're not a Slate Plus member, first of all, we're not angry, but we're disappointed. We're really disappointed. Actually, no, we're fucking angry. Sign up. It keeps us alive and going. It's our lifeblood. Trust me. Do that today at slate.com/cultureplus. Members get ad-free podcasts. You get lots of bonus content like the Slate Plus segment I just mentioned. You get to hear members-only programming on other Slate shows like Slow Burn and the Political Gabfest. It's actually a phenomenally good deal. You get unlimited access to all the great writing on slate.com. You never hit a paywall if you're a Slate Plus member. Should also mention that you'll be supporting our work and the work of our brilliant colleagues, if that wasn't clear already. These memberships are really important for Slate. So please sign up today, slate.com/cultureplus. Again, that's slate.com/cultureplus, or subscribe now on Apple Podcasts by clicking try free at the top of our show page. All right, back to the show.
Fellas, shall we endorse? Sam, you're our guest today. Why don't you kick us off?
Okay. So my endorsement for this week is Naomi Klein's book Doppelganger, which is from 2023. But
Did you know that I endorsed it last week?
I did not. Oh.
Did you know that I was reading it this morning? Like literally cracked it open this morning?
No, I think you should. It's like so opposite to the moment. I feel like you should endorse it too, Sam.
Okay. All right. Well, if I may re-endorse, I wanted to offer my own reasons for turning to Naomi Klein's Doppelganger, which is from 2023, but I think we've all been reading and thinking about recently. I just picked it up. It's been sitting on a shelf for, I don't know, a year and a half or something, and I just picked it up in January. Seems like it'd be relevant to the moment and turned out to be way more so than I even suspected. The sort of crux of the book, its inciting incident, is during the pandemic when everybody goes super online and the sort of general tendency to confuse Naomi Klein and Naomi Wolf really becomes, a meme, among other things. What interests me is that it's a record of Naomi Klein's sort of intellectual development, particularly over the last, several years, becoming sort of not by choice extremely online, and what she feels like that's done to her brain space. What really interests me is that this is sort of as the book as a history of Naomi Wolf, who I came into awareness of as a sort of pop feminist figure in the 1990s, and then had, sort of lost track of, and then kind of came back to knowing about her when she became kind of a running joke for doing a nonfiction book built around an enormous error, which was uncovered live on the radio, and the book basically got withdrawn and pulped. And as a result of that, she's become increasingly radicalized and rightnized, and is now sort of a regular Steve Bannon, Tucker Carlson guest. And the way that particular public embarrassment has really pushed her in a certain political direction seems really opposite to the moment, the way that sort of, resentment and devaluation has led her to, become sort of, anti-vax, and indulge in these sort of, conspiracy theories about how 5G networks are frying our brains. That development just seems really critical to where a much larger and less famous group of people have ended up at the moment. And just, it's not like all this stuff has been happening sub rosa over the last several years. It's not really a surprise even as we're going through it, let alone in retrospect. But just reading through the book and seeing all these names that are now so unfortunately prominent in our national culture, like, J.D. Vance and Bannon and Elon Musk, all sort of make their way through this book, which was published in 2023. So I dislike the word prescient, and I wouldn't necessarily call it that, but it really does underline going back through her experience of the pandemic, watching people that she considered sort of, reasonable liberal neighbors become, incredibly sort of radicalized and further than that because of COVID lockdowns and vaccine mandates. Really, it's very easy to see how we ended up here, and not so easy to see where we go from there.
Why were you reading it this morning, Steve?
It's a topical, theme-driven, memoir-adjacent work of nonfiction. And as someone attempting to write something in that vein, I just wanted to reread her opening and saw how she got into it, which is beautifully, really elegantly.
Yeah, it's an amazing opening because I talked about this last week when I endorsed it, but it should not work. It's an insane concept for a book. Like, I'm going to take my fixation on this fringe character and like do a whole thing about it. And the tone she strikes just as a matter of like writing execution in addition to how topical it is. Anyway, okay, well, it does seem like the Culture Gabfest thinks you should read Doppelganger if you haven't already. I know like you guys discussed it without me last year, Steve. It's very much on everybody's minds. So that is a good one.
It is going to be on the final at this point. So,
yeah. Sam, I want to know why you dislike the word prescience. It has that wonderful soft middle, the hard plosive up front, and then that lovely soft middle part, and then a kind of.
He didn't say he didn't like the way it sounded.
I mean, phonetically, I'm on your side. Aesthetically,
and
sure.
The way it whispers off into oblivion at the end, prescience.
Yes, I don't know. It just feels like an often kind of glib way of instilling a certain importance, and I don't necessarily think it's the job of fiction or even nonfiction to like get it right. So when people are like, "Oh, The Matrix was so prescient," because now we have cell phones.
It is. It's a cousin to seminal in its poor use.
Seminal, portentous, prescience. There's a list of forbidden words. Liminal. Yeah, it's on.
But it is a lovely collection of sounds. I agree with you there.
Yeah, it is kind of a prescient book, though. All right, Steve, what have you got this week besides Doppelganger's writing craft?
Extreme non-prescience, in fact, counter-programming. I previously endorsed the Helen Garner novel, The Children's Bach, for those of you who might have forgotten what I said. Garner is an Australian writer who I've come to really admire. She writes both fiction and nonfiction. I finished The Children's Bach, which was an incredibly slim book, but I endorsed it when I was halfway through. Its genius really came home to me in the way she sets up these sort of tableau situations. I mean, she vividly portrays, showing without telling, a household and the various relationships within the household. And it's what's left unspoken, like the fact that this novel is so slim and so much life gets described in it without it ever feeling at all dense, was remarkable. So I'm not going to endorse it twice. What I am going to endorse is Helen Garner seems to be breaking at least a little bit bigger in the rest of the Anglosphere. Australians who admire her will tell her that it's a shame. They really are surprised and a little bit dismayed that she's never had quite the following in UK and America. But The Guardian long read section published a kind of profile of her, the savage suburbia of Helen Garner. And Dwight Garner just wrote a review of her diaries, which have a kind of Knausgard heft and meticulousness to them. And they're just being published now. But anyway, Dwight's piece was typically wonderful. But I really, really recommend this profile. It is in addition to being about a writer I really admire and getting at sort of how her status as a suburban Melburnian has inhibited her reputation maybe outside of Australia, but also what her genius is and how she deserves to be better known. It is just one of the most elegantly written and truly one of the best literary profiles I've ever read. It's wonderful. It's by a writer named Sophie Elmhirst. Once again, it's called The Savage Suburbia of Helen Garner. I couldn't recommend it enough. Even if you've never read a word of Garner, this is a beautiful entree. It's a way in. We'll link to it.
Cool. That sounds great. I have a purely bright and joyous and silly endorsement in this grave week, which is every year when my sons have their birthday, I bake them each a cake, and one son always gets the same cake and the other one always likes to request something new. And this year requested a Reese's Pieces cake, which required me to find a peanut butter cake recipe, sort of out of my own stubbornness because the other cake was going to be chocolate and I didn't feel like making 2 chocolate cakes. Possibly my son would have preferred it if I had just done that. Peanut butter cake, is that a thing? Not really. I looked in every single cookbook. I looked all over the internet. Not that many recipes out there for it. But I found on a site called Cakes by MK, a New Zealand baker, a recipe for moist peanut butter cake with peanut butter frosting. Too much peanut butter, you might think? Kind of, but it was so weirdly delicious. Like a weirdly delicious cake, a beautiful peanut butter crumb cake, a like luscious peanut butter buttercream that's light and fluffy. And then I coated the outside of it with Reese's Pieces, which were nice, added some nice crunch to the mix. The recipe for this cake had a teeny bit of cornstarch in it. I have never used cornstarch in baking before. If anybody wants to tell me why I might have or what it might have done to the cake, I'd be delighted for your scientific explanations. But the cake was very, very, very light and fluffy and somehow not too peanut buttery. I don't know, man. More people should be making peanut butter cakes. This was a good cake. There were some comments from my son that perhaps a chocolate frosting would have added more variation. And it's true. It would have. But somehow this was a very delicious and weird cake. So Cakes by MK, I'm going to go back to her website and see what other New Zealand baking treats she's getting up to, because it really, you know how when you read a random internet recipe that's not from New York Times Cooking and it's not from Epicurious and it's from like Preppy Kitchen or Melinda's Baking Garage or whatever the heck, you sort of have to apply your critical reasoning skills in the way that you do when reading Amazon comments to see whether the comments are bot-like or fake. Like this, I could tell just from the recipe, which I sent to a baker friend of mine as well. I was like, this has like the hallmarks of a sound recipe, like the way this person is describing and advising the cooking to happen. I feel that I can trust this, and I did not make a mistake. So Cakes by MK, New Zealand baker, peanut butter cake, give it a whirl. If it sounds at all appealing to you, give it a whirl.
The case for cake. You make a strong one. Yeah.
Indeed. All right. Sam, thank you so much for sitting in this week.
Thank you all for having me.
Steven, thank you.
Thanks, Julia.
You'll find links to some of the things we talked about today on our show page. That's slate.com/culturefest. And you can email us at culturefest@slate.com. Our introductory theme music is by the composer Nicholas Bertel, and our producer and also the provider of our research assistance is Vic Whitley-Berry. For Steve Metcalf and Sam Adams, I'm Julia Turner. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you next week.
Get the Angel Reese special at McDonald's now. Let's break it down. My favorite barbecue sauce, American cheese, crispy bacon, pickles, onions, and a sesame seed bun, of course. And don't forget the fries and a drink. Sound good? Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
At participating restaurants for a limited time.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are now boarding Group A. Please have your boarding passes ready to scan. If your phone is cracked, old, or was chewed up by your Chihuahua travel companion, please refrain from holding up the line. Instead, go to Verizon and trade in any phone in any condition from one of their top brands for the new Samsung Galaxy S25 Plus with Galaxy AI and a watch and tab on any plan. Only on Verizon.
With new line on My Plan. Service plan required for watch and tab. Additional terms apply. See Verizon.com for details.